My daughter looked me straight in the eye and said the words that would change everything between us. "Mom, we can't afford to throw money at every medical scare you have." What she didn't know was that by the time she finished that sentence, I had already decided she'd never see a penny of the $12 million sitting in accounts she'd never heard of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by Dr. Martinez in his sterile office that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. The tumor in my pancreas was operable, he said, but time was critical. Without surgery within the next month, my chances dropped significantly. With it, I had an excellent prognosis for full recovery. I sat there in that uncomfortable chair, clutching my purse like it might anchor me to something solid, and asked the question that had been clawing at my throat since he'd said the word tumor. What does something like this cost? Dr. Martinez shifted in his chair, the way doctors do when they're about to deliver news that hits your wallet as hard as your heart. The procedure itself, plus the hospital stay and follow-up care, you're looking at around $85,000. Your insurance will cover about 60%, which leaves roughly $34,000 out of pocket. $34,000. I nodded calmly, thanked him, and scheduled the surgery for 3 weeks out. What I didn't tell him was that $34,000 was less than what I spent on groceries some months back when I was feeding a family of 5 and shopping like money grew on trees in the backyard. The drive home from the hospital took me through downtown Riverside, past the old textile mill where I'd worked double shifts for 15 years, past the community college where I'd taken night classes in accounting, past the small house on Maple Street where I'd raised 3 children on a secretary's salary and dreams that felt too big for my zip code. Everything looked smaller now, faded around the edges like an old photograph that had been handled too much. I pulled into the driveway of my current home, a modest 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood where the biggest excitement was Mrs. Chen's flower garden and the occasional loose dog. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just pale yellow siding and a front porch that needed new boards, but it was mine. Paid off 10 years ago with cash that my children assumed came from their father's life insurance policy. They weren't entirely wrong. Robert's life insurance had been substantial, but it wasn't the only money that came my way after his death. What they didn't know about was the investment portfolio he'd built in secret, the rental properties he'd quietly acquired, and the technology stocks he'd bought on hunches that turned out to be worth more than either of us had ever imagined. Robert had been a quiet man, methodical in ways that sometimes drove me crazy, but his financial instincts had been flawless. When the lawyers finished settling his estate, I found myself sitting on assets worth just over $12 million. I'd kept quiet about it, not out of shame or fear, but because I'd seen what sudden wealth did to families. I'd watched friends and neighbors turn into strangers when money entered the picture, watched siblings become enemies over inheritance disputes, watched children start treating their parents like ATMs instead of people. So I'd lived modestly, continued working until I chose to retire, and let my children assume I was just another widow getting by on Social Security and whatever small inheritance their father had left behind. The truth was locked away in investment accounts and trust funds that bore names they'd never heard, managed by a firm in the city that sent statements to APO, the box I checked once a month. That evening, I called my oldest daughter Rebecca first. She lived 40 minutes away in a subdivision that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought houses should resemble miniature castles, complete with turrets and unnecessary stonework. Rebecca had always been the practical one, the child who balanced her checkbook to the penny and never bought anything without researching it first. If anyone would understand the medical necessity of this surgery, it would be her. "Mom, slow down," she said when I explained the situation. I could hear her 2 young sons arguing in the background, something about whose turn it was to use the iPad. "You said $85,000 total, but insurance covers most of it, right?" "Right. I need to come up with about $34,000. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough for you to realize the conversation is about to go somewhere you weren't expecting. "Mom, that's a lot of money. Are you sure this is absolutely necessary? I mean, have you gotten a second opinion?" I stared at the wall above my kitchen table, where I'd hung a small painting of a lighthouse that Robert had bought me for our 20th anniversary. "Rebecca, it's cancer. Dr. Martinez is one of the best pancreatic surgeons in the state. I trust his judgment." I know, but $34,000. She trailed off, and I could hear her husband David in the background, asking who was on the phone. "Mom, we're barely keeping our heads above water with the mortgage and the boys' activities. David's been putting in overtime just to cover our health insurance premium increase. I wish I could help, but we just don't have that kind of cash lying around." I told her I understood, that I was just letting her know what was happening, that I'd figure something out. But as I hung up the phone, something cold and hard settled in my chest. Rebecca hadn't offered to help me research payment plans. She hadn't suggested I look into medical loans or ask the hospital about financial assistance programs. She'd simply calculated the cost against her own budget and found it lacking. My son Marcus was next. He lived in the city, worked for a tech company that seemed to hand out stock options like candy, and drove a car that cost more than most people's houses. Marcus had always been the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of trouble or into opportunities with equal ease. He'd inherited his father's gift for numbers but preferred to use it for cryptocurrency trading and what he called investment strategies that sounded more like gambling to me. "Jesus, Mom, that's terrible news," he said when I told him about the diagnosis. "But hey, at least they caught it early, right? That's what matters. You're going to beat this thing." I appreciated his optimism, even if it felt a little hollow. "The surgery isn't cheap, Marcus. After insurance, I'm looking at owing about $34,000. 34 grand? He whistled low. "That's brutal. Healthcare in this country is just criminal, honestly. Have you looked into going to Mexico? I read an article about medical tourism, and some of these places are supposed to be really good. Might save you half the cost." "I'm not going to Mexico for pancreatic surgery, Marcus." "Right, yeah, I get that. It's just, 34,000 is a lot of money. I mean, I'm doing okay, but I've got all my cash tied up in investments right now. Market's been crazy volatile, and if I liquidate anything now, I'd take a huge loss. Plus, there's the tax implications." He kept talking, explaining his financial situation in terms that made it sound like he was running a Fortune 500 company instead of day trading from his downtown apartment. I let him talk until he ran out of steam, then told him I'd figure it out and ended the call. My youngest, Patricia, lived closest to me, just 15 minutes away in a townhouse complex that had been built where the old Riverside Elementary School used to stand. Patricia had always been the most emotional of my children, quick to tears and even quicker to hug. She'd been the one who called me every week just to chat, who remembered my birthday without prompting, who still sent me cards on Mother's Day that made me cry. "Oh, Mom," she said when I broke the news, and I could hear the tears starting before she even finished the sentence. "I'm so sorry. This is just awful timing." I waited for her to collect herself, listen to her blow her nose and take deep breaths the way she used to do when she was little and had scraped her knee or lost a toy. "The surgery is expensive, honey. About 34,000 out of pocket." "God, that's so much money." She was quiet for a moment, and I could picture her in her kitchen, probably sitting at the small table by the window where she liked to drink her morning coffee. "Mom, I wish I could help. I really do. But Jake's been out of work for 3 months now, and we're barely scraping by on my teacher's salary. We've already had to ask my in-laws for help with the mortgage twice this year. I just don't know where we'd get that kind of money." Patricia was the only one who sounded genuinely upset about not being able to help, but the result was the same. 3 children, 3 different excuses, 3 different ways of telling me that $34,000 was too much to spend on keeping their mother alive. I sat in my kitchen that night, drinking tea from a mug Rebecca had given me years ago that said "World's Best Mom" in faded pink letters, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. These were the children I'd raised, the ones I'd worked double shifts to buy school clothes for, the ones I'd driven to soccer practice and piano lessons and birthday parties, the ones I'd stayed up all night with when they had fevers or nightmares or broken hearts. Rebecca, who I'd helped through college by taking out loans I'd paid off for years afterward. Marcus, who I'd bailed out of credit card debt twice in his 20s. Patricia, who I'd given $5,000 to help with her wedding, money I'd saved by working weekends at the department store for 6 months. Not one of them had asked if I had any savings. Not one had offered to help me set up a payment plan or research other options. They'd all simply done the math, decided the number was too big, and moved on to explaining why their own financial situations made it impossible to help. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez's office and moved my surgery date up by a week. Then I called my financial advisor, a woman named Catherine Walsh who'd been managing Robert's investments since before his death. Catherine had always been discreet, professional, and entirely uninterested in my personal life beyond how it affected my financial planning. She was exactly the kind of person you wanted handling money you didn't want anyone else to know about. "Sarah, good to hear from you," Catherine said when her assistant put me through. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to liquidate about $50,000 from the conservative portfolio," I said. "Nothing dramatic, just a straightforward transfer to my checking account." "Of course. Any particular reason for the withdrawal? Major purchase, home repairs, something I should be aware of for tax planning purposes?" I looked out my kitchen window at Mrs. Chen's garden, where she was already out in her robe, watering the tulips that were just starting to bloom. Medical expenses. Surgery. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope everything goes well. The transfer should be in your account by tomorrow afternoon. Will there be anything else? Actually, yes. I want to update my will. Remove my children as beneficiaries and redirect everything to charity. Can you recommend someone who handles estate planning? There was a pause, longer than Catherine's usual professional beats. Sarah, that's a significant change. Are you sure you want to make that decision right now, when you're dealing with medical stress? Sometimes it's better to wait until after a major procedure to make emotional decisions about estate planning. It's not emotional, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. It's practical. I've learned something important about my children's priorities, and I want my estate to reflect my own priorities accordingly. Catherine gave me the name of an attorney and promised to have the financial records ready for any estate planning meetings. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete clarity about what I needed to do next. The surgery was scheduled for the following Thursday. I arranged for a neighbor to drive me to the hospital and pick me up, the same Mrs. Chen who grew the beautiful tulips and never asked intrusive questions about my personal life. I stocked my refrigerator with easy meals, arranged for someone to collect my mail, and set up a simple recovery space in my living room with everything I'd need within arm's reach. What I didn't do was call my children to let them know the surgery date had been moved up. If $34,000 was too expensive to spend on my life, then I decided my recovery time was too valuable to spend on people who'd made their priorities so clear. The day before the surgery, Rebecca called to check in. Hi, Mom. I was just thinking about you and wanted to see how you're doing with everything. Have you figured out the money situation? I've taken care of it, I said. Oh, good. I was worried about you. How did you manage it? Did the hospital set up a payment plan? I could have told her the truth. I could have explained that $50,000 was a rounding error in my monthly investment statements, that I had enough money to pay for a dozen surgeries without affecting my lifestyle in any meaningful way. Instead, I said, I found a way to make it work. That's great, Mom. I'm so relieved. When's the surgery again? Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? Her voice pitched higher. I thought it was next week. The schedule changed. Dr. Martinez had an opening. But tomorrow's Thursday. I have a parent-teacher conference, and David has that work dinner he can't miss. Can you reschedule? I looked at the lighthouse painting again, remembering the day Robert gave it to me. We'd been walking on the beach, and he'd pointed to a real lighthouse in the distance and said it reminded him of me, steady and reliable and always showing people the way home. No, Rebecca. I can't reschedule. Well, who's going to drive you? Who's going to be there with you? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've arranged for transportation and support. Which was technically true, even if my support system consisted of a 70-year-old neighbor who barely spoke English and a stack of library books I'd been meaning to read. Mom, this is crazy. You can't go through surgery alone. Let me call Patricia, see if she can rearrange her schedule. Don't bother. I'll be fine. But what if something goes wrong? What if there are complications? Someone needs to be your emergency contact, someone needs to be able to make decisions if you can't. For a moment, hearing the worry in her voice, I almost softened. Almost told her that I understood why $34,000 seemed like too much money, that I didn't blame her for not being able to help. But then I remembered the way she'd dismissed the necessity of the surgery, the way she'd suggested I get a second opinion not because she was concerned about my health, but because she was concerned about the cost. I've already filled out all the paperwork, I said. Everything's handled. This is insane, Mom. You're being ridiculous. Just because we can't help with the money doesn't mean we don't care about you. That sentence hung in the air between us like a challenge. Just because we can't help with the money doesn't mean we don't care about you. As if caring was something separate from action, as if love was a feeling that existed independently of what you were willing to sacrifice for someone. I have to go, I said. I need to get ready for tomorrow. Mom, wait. Let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. I'll call you when I'm recovered. I hung up before she could respond, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace with my decision. My children had shown me exactly how much my life was worth to them. Now I was going to show them exactly how much their inheritance was worth to me. The surgery went perfectly. Dr. Martinez removed the tumor completely, and the pathology report showed clean margins with no signs that the cancer had spread. I spent 3 days in the hospital, during which time I received exactly 2 visitors, Mrs. Chen, who brought me a small potted orchid and sat quietly beside my bed for an hour, and Catherine Walsh, who came by to have me sign some papers and update my financial information. My children didn't visit, but they did call. Rebecca called twice, both times going straight to voicemail because I'd turned off my phone. Marcus sent a text message asking if I was okay and if I needed anything. Patricia left a voicemail that was mostly crying and apologies and promises to come see me as soon as I was home. I went home on Sunday afternoon with a clean bill of health, a prescription for pain medication I didn't need, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks out. Mrs. Chen had stocked my refrigerator with homemade soup and left fresh flowers on my kitchen table. She'd also collected my mail, which included a thick envelope from the estate planning attorney Catherine had recommended. I spent Sunday evening reading through the documents that would redistribute my wealth to causes I actually cared about. The local food bank where I'd volunteered for years, the scholarship fund at the community college where I'd gotten my accounting degree, the animal shelter where I'd adopted my cat Whiskers, and the Pancreatic Cancer Research Foundation that had funded the development of the surgical technique that had just saved my life. $12 million, divided equally among organizations that spent their time making the world better instead of calculating whether other people's lives were worth their investment. Monday morning, I called Rebecca to let her know I was home and recovering well. She sounded relieved to hear from me, and for a few minutes, our conversation felt almost normal. She asked about my pain levels, whether I needed help with groceries, if the surgeon had been happy with how everything went. "I'm so glad it's over," she said. "I was worried sick about you going through that alone." "I wasn't alone," I said. "I had everything I needed." "I know, but family should be there for things like this. I feel terrible that we couldn't make it work." "You made your priorities clear," I said. I respected that. There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean you told me that $34,000 was too much to spend on my surgery. You were honest about your priorities." I appreciated the honesty. "Mom, that's not fair. We wanted to help, we just couldn't afford it. That doesn't mean we don't love you." "I never said you didn't love me, Rebecca. I said you made your priorities clear. And you did." "Our priorities?" "Our priority was making sure you got the medical care you needed. We just couldn't pay for it. You never asked if I had savings. You never offered to help me research payment plans or financial assistance programs. You never suggested that maybe, between the three of you, you could figure out a way to help your mother afford cancer surgery. You just calculated the cost against your own budgets and decided it was too expensive. That's not how it happened." "That's exactly how it happened, Rebecca. And it's fine. You're adults with your own financial responsibilities. But don't pretend this was about anything other than money. You're being unfair." "I'm being accurate. You told me that keeping me alive wasn't worth $34,000. I heard you. And I planned accordingly." I hung up before she could respond, and I turned off my phone for the rest of the day. I had recovering to do, and I didn't want to spend my energy on people who'd already shown me how they valued my time. The next few weeks passed quietly. I healed faster than Dr. Martinez had expected, regained my strength, and started taking longer walks around the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen and I developed a routine of having coffee together on Tuesday mornings, during which she told me about her grandchildren in California and I told her about the books I was reading. She never asked about my family, and I never offered to explain why they didn't visit. Patricia showed up at my door 3 weeks after the surgery, carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd been working up the courage for this conversation for days. I let her in, accepted the casserole, and made us both tea while she sat at my kitchen table and fidgeted with her purse strap. "Mom, I'm sorry," she finally said. "I'm sorry I couldn't help with the money, and I'm sorry I wasn't there for the surgery. I've been feeling terrible about it." I sat down across from her with my tea, studying her face. Patricia had always been easy to read, every emotion written clearly across her features. Right now, she looked genuinely distressed, but also frustrated, like someone who felt she was being punished for something that wasn't her fault. "I appreciate the apology," I said. "Rebecca said you were angry at us. She said you think we don't care about you." "I'm not angry. And I never said you don't care about me. But you think we should have helped with the surgery money." I sipped my tea and considered how to answer that. "I think that when someone you love needs life-saving surgery, you find a way to help. You ask questions, you research options, you sacrifice something if you have to. You don't just calculate the cost and decide it's too expensive." "But we couldn't afford it, Mom. We really couldn't." "Patricia, you and Jake spent $4,500 on your vacation to Florida last year. You posted pictures of the resort, the spa treatments, the expensive dinners. Marcus bought a motorcycle for $8,000 that he's ridden maybe 6 times. Rebecca remodeled her kitchen last spring, and I know that cost at least $20,000 because she showed me the invoices. Patricia stared at me. That's different. How is it different? Those were our choices about our own money. Exactly. You chose to spend money on vacations and motorcycles and kitchen renovations. You chose not to spend money on helping your mother survive cancer. Those were all choices, Patricia. And choices reveal priorities. That's not fair. It's completely fair. I'm not angry about your choices. I'm just clear about what they mean. We would have helped if we could have. No, you would have helped if you'd wanted to badly enough to make it a priority. There's a difference. Patricia started crying then, the same helpless tears she'd cried as a child when she'd been caught in a lie or faced consequences she didn't think she deserved. I don't know what you want from us. I don't want anything from you. I wanted something 3 weeks ago, and you made it clear you couldn't provide it. That's fine. But don't expect me to pretend it didn't happen. So what now? You're just going to cut us out of your life? I looked at her sitting at my kitchen table, crying into her hands, and felt something I hadn't expected, sadness. Not anger, not betrayal, just deep sadness for the relationship we could have had if she'd been the person I'd hoped she was. I'm not cutting you out of my life, Patricia. But I'm also not going to pretend that you're someone you're not. You're my daughter, and I love you. But you're also someone who decided that $34,000 was too much to spend on your mother's life. I can love you and still be clear about who you are. She left still crying, taking her casserole dish with her. I watched her drive away and then went back inside to finish the crossword puzzle I'd been working on before she arrived. It was a Tuesday, which meant I had coffee with Mrs. Chen the next morning, and I wanted to finish the puzzle so I could show her how I'd figured out the tricky clue about lighthouse keepers. Marcus came by the following weekend, unannounced, the way he always did when he wanted something. He knocked on my door Saturday morning while I was watering the small herb garden I'd started on my back patio, something to keep my hands busy during recovery. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving me the same charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "You look great. How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling fine, Marcus. Completely recovered." "That's awesome. I'm so glad. Everything went well with the surgery." He followed me inside, making the kind of small talk he specialized in, commenting on my herb garden, asking about my recovery, telling me about his latest investment opportunities. After 15 minutes of pleasant conversation, he got to the point. "So, Mom, I've been thinking about what happened with the surgery money, and I feel bad about how that went down." I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter, waiting for him to continue. "I know you probably think I was being selfish, not helping out, but the truth is, my finances are more complicated than I made them sound. I've got money, but it's all tied up in investments that are really time-sensitive. I couldn't liquidate anything without taking a huge loss." "I understand," I said. "But here's the thing. I've been doing really well lately. Like, really well. This cryptocurrency thing I've been working on is about to pay off big time. We're talking life-changing money, Mom. And when it does, I want to pay you back for the surgery. With interest." I studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity behind the practiced enthusiasm. "Pay me back for what?" "For the surgery money. I know you had to figure out how to cover it yourself, and I want to make that right. When this deal comes through, I'm going to write you a check for $50,000. 34 for the surgery, plus interest, plus a little extra for the stress I put you through. That's very generous of you, Marcus. It's the least I can do. You're my mom, and I should have been there for you. I'm going to make it right." I nodded and smiled, the same polite smile I'd been giving him since he was a teenager trying to explain why he'd wrecked the car or failed a class. "I appreciate the thought." "It's not just a thought, Mom. This is happening. Probably within the next month or two. I'm going to take care of you." After he left, I called Catherine Walsh to discuss accelerating the timeline for my estate planning changes. If Marcus was planning to take care of me with money he expected to inherit, I wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings about what he'd be inheriting. The attorney's office had prepared all the documents, and I spent the following Tuesday morning signing papers that would redirect $12 million away from children who thought $34,000 was too expensive to spend on my life. Catherine was there to witness the signatures, and she brought along a notary to make everything official. "You're sure about this?" Catherine asked as I signed the last document. "This is irreversible, Sarah. Once these papers are filed, your children will have no claim on your estate." "I'm completely sure," I said. "My children made their priorities clear when I needed them most. Now I'm making my priorities clear while I still can." The documents were filed that afternoon. By the end of the week, I was officially a woman whose entire fortune would go to organizations that spent their time helping people instead of calculating whether those people were worth helping. I felt lighter than I had in months. Summer passed quietly. I took up painting again, something I'd enjoyed before marriage and children had consumed all my time and energy. Mrs. Chen taught me how to grow tomatoes, and I taught her how to make my grandmother's recipe for peach cobbler. We developed a friendship that was based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. My children called occasionally, but our conversations were polite and distant. Rebecca updated me on her boys' soccer seasons. Marcus told me about his investment successes, though the life-changing cryptocurrency deal he'd promised never quite materialized. Patricia shared stories about her students and Jake's job search. None of them asked how I'd paid for the surgery. None of them seemed curious about my financial situation or whether I needed help with anything. They treated me like a pleasant acquaintance they felt obligated to check on periodically, someone who existed on the periphery of their real lives. In September, I got a call from Dr. Martinez's office scheduling my 6-month follow-up appointment. The scan results were perfect, no signs of cancer recurrence, and Dr. Martinez pronounced me officially cured. I celebrated by taking Mrs. Chen out to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, where we toasted my clean bill of health with glasses of wine that cost more than my children thought I could afford to spend in a week. That night, I updated my will one final time, adding a small codicil that would ensure my children received exactly what they'd determined my life was worth, nothing. But I also added a provision that would send each of them a letter after my death, explaining exactly how much money they'd chosen not to inherit and why. I wanted them to understand that their decision to prioritize their own financial comfort over their mother's life had consequences. I wanted them to know that $12 million had been redistributed to organizations that believed in taking care of people when they needed it most. Most importantly, I wanted them to realize that love without sacrifice isn't love at all. It's just a word people use when they want to feel good about themselves without actually doing anything difficult. I sealed the letters in envelopes and gave them to Catherine to include with the will. Then I went home to my quiet house, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on my back patio watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time since Robert died, I felt completely at peace with my life and completely confident in my choices. My children had taught me an important lesson about priorities, and I'd learned it well. The only difference was that I'd had the resources to make my priorities matter in ways they'd never expected. Tomorrow, Mrs. Chen was going to teach me how to make dumplings, and I was going to teach her how to play bridge. We were going to have coffee and talk about books and tend our gardens and live our lives without calculating the cost of caring about each other. It was exactly the kind of life I'd always wanted, and it had only cost me the illusion that family was more important than the people who actually treated me like family. I thought that was a bargain. The months that followed my recovery settled into a rhythm I hadn't experienced since before Robert died. There was something profoundly liberating about waking up each morning knowing that my day belonged entirely to me, that I didn't owe anyone explanations or updates or emotional labor I couldn't afford to give. October brought the kind of crisp weather that made everything feel possible again. I started taking longer walks, exploring parts of Riverside I'd never bothered to visit when I was working and raising children and managing a household that always seemed to need something. There was a small lake about 2 miles from my house, surrounded by walking trails and benches where people brought their dogs and their morning coffee and their quiet thoughts. I became a regular there, arriving most mornings around 8 with a thermos of tea and a book I was working through. The other regulars began to nod when they saw me, the kind of polite acknowledgement that passes between people who share space without needing to share stories. There was an elderly man who fed the ducks despite the signs asking people not to, a woman about my age who power-walked the entire perimeter twice while talking loudly on her phone, and a younger couple who brought their toddler to throw rocks in the water while they sat on a blanket and watched. It was peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. No one needed anything from me. No one was calculating whether I was worth their time or energy. I was just another person in the world, existing without justification or explanation. The first sign that my children were growing restless with our new dynamic came in late October, when Rebecca called on a Wednesday evening while I was making dinner for one and actually enjoying the process. "Mom, I've been thinking," she said after the usual pleasantries about my health and the weather. "We should plan something for Thanksgiving. It's been too long since we all got together as a family." I stirred the soup I was making, a simple tomato basil that smelled exactly like comfort should. "That's a nice thought, Rebecca. I was thinking we could do it at my house this year. Make it easy on everyone. You know how much work it is to host Thanksgiving, and you're still recovering from surgery." "I'm completely recovered, actually. Dr. Martinez cleared me for all normal activities months ago." "Right, of course. I just meant, you shouldn't have to worry about cooking for everyone and cleaning up afterward. Let me take care of it this year. There was something in her voice that made me pause, a carefully casual tone that suggested. This conversation was about more than turkey and stuffing. What did you have in mind? Nothing fancy. Just family. You, me, and David and the boys, Marcus, Patricia, and Jake. Maybe we could cook together, like we used to when Dad was alive. Remember how he always insisted on making the gravy himself, even though it turned out lumpy every single time? I did remember. Robert had been stubborn about his gravy, convinced that each year he'd finally master the technique, never quite accepting that some people simply weren't meant to work with flour and butter and patience. It was one of those small, ridiculous traditions that had made our family feel solid and predictable and permanent. That sounds lovely, I said, though something in my chest felt tight. Great. So we'll plan on the usual time, around 2 o'clock? And Mom, don't worry about bringing anything elaborate. Maybe just a dessert or something simple. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding my wooden spoon and trying to identify the feeling that had settled over me like fog. It wasn't quite dread, but it wasn't anticipation either. It was something closer to resignation, the way you feel when you know you're about to participate in something that will require you to be someone you're no longer sure you want to be. I finished making my soup, ate it while reading a mystery novel about a librarian who solved murders in her spare time, and went to bed early. But I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and wondering if it was possible to love people, while simultaneously dreading spending time with them. The next morning, Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with a basket of late-season tomatoes from her garden and the kind of smile that suggested she had something on her mind. We'd developed enough of a friendship that I could read her moods, even when her English failed her and she had to resort to gestures and facial expressions to communicate. "Sarah," she said, holding up one particularly large tomato. "You teach me make the soup? The one that smells so good yesterday?" I invited her in and spent the morning walking her through my simple tomato basil recipe, watching her take careful notes in a mixture of English and Chinese characters. Mrs. Chen approached cooking the way she approached gardening, with methodical attention to detail and genuine curiosity about the process. As we worked, she told me about her plans for the upcoming holidays. Her son and daughter-in-law were driving down from Virginia with her 2 granddaughters, and she was already preparing for their visit by stocking her freezer with homemade dumplings and planning activities that would keep 2 energetic girls entertained for a week. "Family is complicated," she said while we waited for the soup to simmer. "Always love, but sometimes also difficult." I looked at her, wondering if she'd overheard my phone conversation the night before or if she was simply making the kind of observation that came with age and experience. "How do you mean?" "Children grow up, become different people. Still your children, but also strangers sometimes. You love the memory of who they were, but maybe not so much who they are." Her English was better than she usually let on, I realized. She'd been in this country for 40 years, had raised 3 children here, buried a husband here, built a life here. She understood exactly what she was saying. "That's very wise," I said. "Not wise. Just old. Old people see patterns. Same problems, different faces." We ate the soup together when it was finished, sitting at my kitchen table while autumn sunlight streamed through the windows and made everything feel warm and golden and temporary. Mrs. Chen was right about patterns. I was seeing them too, recognizing the shapes of relationships I'd thought were unique but were actually as common as the changing seasons. The pattern of adult children who took their parents for granted until they needed something. The pattern of people who confused love with obligation and obligation with love. The pattern of families who got together for holidays not because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company, but because that's what families were supposed to do. Marcus called that weekend to confirm Thanksgiving plans, and his enthusiasm felt performative in a way that made me tired before the conversation even really began. "Mom, Rebecca told me about Thanksgiving at her place. That's going to be awesome. It's been way too long since we all hung out together." Hung out. As if we were college friends getting together for drinks instead of a family navigating the aftermath of showing their mother exactly how little her life was worth to them. "I'm looking forward to it," I said, which wasn't technically a lie. I was looking forward to it being over. I've been thinking, actually, about what we talked about before. About making things right with the surgery money? Well, I've got some good news on that front. I waited, curious to see what version of financial success he'd constructed this time. "Remember that cryptocurrency deal I mentioned? Well, it's not quite ready to pay out yet, but I've got something else going. A buddy of mine is launching this new investment platform, and he brought me in as an early investor. The returns have been incredible, Mom. Like, 20% in just 2 months. 20% in 2 months. I'd been managing investments for decades, and I knew exactly what that kind of return usually meant, high risk, unsustainable growth, or outright fraud. But I also knew that Marcus believed he was special, that normal rules didn't apply to him, that his natural charm and intelligence would somehow protect him from the consequences that befell ordinary investors. That sounds very promising, I said. It is. And the best part is, I should be able to cash out enough by Christmas to pay you back for the surgery, plus interest. I told you I was going to take care of you, and I meant it. After we hung up, I called Catherine Walsh to ask about setting up a small investment account under Marcus's name, something he could discover after my death that would teach him about real financial planning versus gambling with money he couldn't afford to lose. $20,000, managed conservatively, with a note explaining the difference between genuine investing and whatever he thought he was doing with his cryptocurrency schemes and get-rich-quick platforms. It wasn't generosity. It was education. The last lesson I'd be able to teach him about money, delivered when it was too late for him to ask me for more. Patricia called the Monday before Thanksgiving, and I could tell from her voice that she'd been working up the courage for the conversation for days. Mom, I wanted to talk to you about Thursday. About Thanksgiving. What about it? I want to make sure we're okay. You and me. I've been feeling weird about how we left things after the surgery, and I don't want it to be awkward when we're all together. I appreciated her directness, even if I suspected it was motivated more by her own discomfort than by genuine concern for my feelings. I'm not planning to make things awkward, Patricia. I know. It's just, you've seemed different since then. More distant. And I understand why, I really do. I just hope we can move past it. Move past what, exactly? The whole thing. With the surgery money. I know you were disappointed that we couldn't help, and I get that. But I also hope you understand that it wasn't because we don't care about you. We just literally didn't have the money. I was quiet for a moment, listening to the sound of her breathing and the television in the background. Jake was watching some kind of sports program, probably football, the way he did most evenings when he wasn't out looking for work that paid better than the part-time retail job he'd taken after his last position was eliminated. Patricia, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about your answer before you give it. Okay. If Jake needed surgery that cost $34,000, surgery that would save his life, what would you do? I'd find a way to pay for it, obviously. How? I don't know. I'd figure it out. Take out loans, sell things, ask for help. Whatever it took. But when your mother needed surgery that cost $34,000, you calculated the cost against your budget and decided you couldn't afford it. That's not fair, Mom. Jake is my husband. And I'm your mother. It's different. How is it different? She was quiet for a long time, and I could practically hear her trying to formulate an answer that would make sense to both of us. It just is. You're stronger than Jake. You can handle things on your own. You always have. There it was, the assumption that had been lurking beneath every conversation we'd had since Robert died. Because I'd managed to survive losing my husband. Because I'd figured out how to live alone and take care of myself. Because I hadn't fallen apart or become a burden, my children had decided I didn't really need them. I was strong, so I could handle cancer surgery alone. I was independent, so I could figure out how to pay for it myself. I was competent, so they didn't need to worry about me the way they worried about each other. I see, I said. Mom, I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? I just meant that you're capable. You always land on your feet. Because I have to, Patricia. Not because I want to. Not because it's easy. Because when people you love decide you're too strong to need help, you either figure out how to be that strong or you fall apart. And falling apart isn't really an option when you're 68 years old and facing cancer surgery. You're not being fair. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. After I hung up, I sat in my living room and thought about strength, about the way people used it as an excuse to avoid taking care of the people who had spent their lives taking care of everyone else. I thought about how being competent and reliable had somehow disqualified me from receiving the same consideration my children expected for themselves. And I thought about Thanksgiving, about sitting around Rebecca's table and pretending that we were a family who cared for each other instead of a collection of adults who shared DNA and holiday obligations and not much else. The morning of Thanksgiving, I baked a pumpkin pie from scratch and drove to Rebecca's house with a bottle of wine that cost more than Patricia spent on groceries in a week. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because I was done pretending to be poorer than I was for the comfort of people who'd already shown me how they felt about my financial needs. Rebecca's house looked exactly like a magazine spread. For suburban Thanksgiving, all harvest decorations and carefully arranged fall foliage. She answered the door wearing an apron that said, "Thankful," in gold glitter letters, and she hugged me with the kind of enthusiasm that felt slightly desperate. "Mom, you look wonderful. How are you feeling? How's the recovery going?" I'm completely recovered, Rebecca. The surgery was 6 months ago. Right, of course. I just worry, you know? Come in, come in. Marcus and Patricia aren't here yet, but David's in the living room watching football with the boys. I followed her into the kitchen, where she had approximately 47 different dishes in various stages of preparation. Rebecca had always been an overachiever, the kind of person who couldn't just make Thanksgiving dinner but had to make the best Thanksgiving dinner anyone had ever experienced. This looks amazing, I said, setting my pie on the counter next to 3 other desserts. Oh, you didn't need to bring a pie. I already made apple and pecan and that chocolate tart David loves. But this looks delicious, thank you. I could see her mentally calculating how she'd fit 4 desserts into a meal that was already overplanned, but I didn't offer to take mine back to the car. I'd been asked to bring dessert, and I'd brought dessert. What she did with it was her problem to solve. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of champagne and the kind of energy that suggested he'd been rehearsing his entrance. He hugged me with more physical contact than we'd shared in years, lifting me slightly off the ground and spinning me in a small circle. "There's my favorite mom," he said, which would have been charming if I'd been his only mom. "How's my warrior doing? Fully recovered from surgery and ready to take on the world?" "I'm doing well, Marcus. Thank you for asking. You look incredible. Seriously, you look better than you did before the surgery. There's something different about you. More relaxed or something." He was right about that, though probably not in the way he meant. I was more relaxed, but it was the relaxation that came from no longer expecting anything from people who'd proven they couldn't provide it. Patricia and Jake arrived just as Rebecca was starting to panic about the timing of everything, and the kitchen filled with the kind of controlled chaos that happens when too many people try to help with too many tasks in too small a space. I stood back and watched my children navigate around each other, noticed how they automatically fell into the same roles they'd occupied as teenagers. Rebecca directing everyone and taking on more work than necessary. Marcus charming his way out of any actual responsibility while making everyone feel like his presence was contribution enough. Patricia trying to help but constantly asking for direction and reassurance. They were the same people they'd always been, just older and more expensive to maintain. Dinner itself was exactly what I'd expected: perfectly prepared food, polite conversation, and the subtle tension that comes from people who are trying very hard to demonstrate how normal and happy they are. David talked about work. Marcus talked about his investment opportunities. Rebecca talked about the boys' academic achievements. Patricia talked about her students. No one asked how I was spending my time. No one seemed curious about my life beyond my health status. I was a pleasant, undemanding presence at their family gathering, someone who required only basic courtesy and contributed predictable responses to predictable conversational topics. After dinner, while Rebecca and Patricia cleaned the kitchen, and David and Jake watched football, Marcus approached me with the kind of casual confidence that meant he was about to ask for something. "Mom, can we talk privately for a minute? I wanted to give you an update on that investment situation I mentioned." We went out onto Rebecca's back patio, where the November air was cold enough to make conversation feel urgent and private. Marcus leaned against the railing and gave me the smile that had been getting him what he wanted since he learned to walk. "So here's the thing," he said. "That investment platform I told you about? It's been doing even better than I expected. But there's an opportunity right now to double down, and I'm a little short on liquid capital." I waited for him to continue, though I could already see exactly where this was heading. "The thing is, if I can come up with another 10,000 by Monday, I can buy into the next tier of the platform. And the projected returns on that level are insane, Mom. We're talking about potentially turning 10,000 into 50,000 over the next 6 months. That does sound impressive." "It is. And here's what I'm thinking. Instead of waiting until Christmas to pay you back for the surgery money, what if I borrowed 10,000 from you now, and then paid you back 50,000 in 6 months? You'd be getting back way more than the surgery cost, plus you'd be helping me take advantage of this opportunity." I looked at him standing there in his expensive jacket, holding his craft beer, asking me to give him money so he could pay me back money I'd never asked him for in the first place. The circular logic was almost admirable in its audacity. "Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I don't need you to pay me back for the surgery. But I want to. I feel bad about not being able to help when you needed it." "If you felt that bad about it, you would have found a way to help when I actually needed it." His smile faltered slightly. "That's not fair, Mom." I explained my situation. I couldn't liquidate my investments without taking a huge loss. "But now you want me to give you more money to put into investments. This is different. This is a sure thing." "Marcus, there are no sure things in investing. If someone is promising you $50,000 in 6 months from a $10,000 investment, they're either lying or planning to steal your money. Mom, you don't understand how this works. This isn't some get-rich-quick scheme. This is legitimate financial technology. I studied his face, looking for any sign that he understood how foolish he sounded. But Marcus had always believed that his enthusiasm could substitute for knowledge, that his confidence could overcome his inexperience. I'm not going to give you $10,000 to gamble with, I said. It's not gambling. It's investing. No, Marcus. Investing is putting money into something with reasonable expected returns and acceptable risk. What you're describing is gambling. And I'm not going to enable your gambling addiction. I don't have a gambling addiction. You have something. And whatever it is, it's not my responsibility to fund it. We went back inside after that, and Marcus spent the rest of the evening being sulky in the way he'd perfected as a teenager when he didn't get what he wanted. He wasn't rude, exactly, but he withdrew his charm like a punishment, as if the warmth of his personality was something he rationed out based on how useful people were to him. I left Rebecca's house that evening with polite hugs and promises to see everyone soon, knowing that I probably wouldn't and that none of them would notice. They'd gotten what they wanted from Thanksgiving, the ability to say they'd included me, the satisfaction of fulfilling their family obligations, the comfort of maintaining traditions that made them feel like good people. And I'd gotten what I needed, confirmation that my decision to redirect my inheritance had been absolutely correct. The following Monday, I called Catherine Walsh to discuss accelerating some of my charitable giving. Instead of waiting until after my death to distribute my wealth, I wanted to start making substantial donations while I was alive to see the impact they would have. That's a significant decision, Sarah, Catherine said. Are you sure you want to give away that much money while you're still alive? What if you need long-term care or have other expensive medical issues? I'll keep enough to take care of myself. Comfortably, I said. But I want to see my money doing good in the world instead of sitting in accounts waiting for people who don't deserve it. What about your children? Are you completely certain you want to cut them out entirely? I thought about Marcus asking me for money to fund his gambling, about Rebecca treating me like a pleasant obligation, about Patricia assuming I was too strong to need help. I'm completely certain. That afternoon, I wrote the first of what would become a series of substantial checks to organizations that actually cared about helping people. The local food bank received $50,000. The literacy program at the community college received another $50,000. The animal shelter received $25,000. Each check came with a note explaining that the donation was being made in memory of Robert Hughes, a man who understood the difference between investing in people and enabling their worst impulses. By Christmas, I'd given away over $500,000 to causes that mattered to me. And for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like my money was being used for something meaningful instead of just accumulating in accounts that bore my name but not my values. My children called on Christmas morning, each of them dutiful and distant. Rebecca thanked me for the sweater I'd sent her boys. Marcus told me about his latest investment idea, carefully avoiding any mention of borrowing money. Patricia updated me on Jake's job search and her plans for the new semester. None of them asked how I'd spent Christmas. None of them seemed to wonder whether I'd been lonely or sad or perfectly content with my quiet holiday. I was a box they checked on their list of family obligations, a responsibility they fulfilled with minimum effort and maximum efficiency. After the last call ended, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and looked at the small tree I decorated with ornaments Robert and I had collected over 30 years of marriage. There were handmade decorations the children had given us. When they were small, careful crafts projects made with construction paper and glue and the kind of love that doesn't calculate costs or weigh benefits. Those children were gone, replaced by adults who saw relationships as transactions and family as a burden they were obligated to maintain. I mourned those children, the ones who had hugged me without expecting anything in return, who had trusted me to take care of them and had taken care of me in the simple, unconscious ways that children do. But I didn't mourn the adults they'd become. Those people had made their choices, had shown me their priorities, had taught me exactly how much space I occupied in their lives. And I'd learned from their lessons. I'd learned that love without action is just sentiment. I'd learned that family who take without giving aren't really family at all. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling people to treat you badly. Most importantly, I'd learned that having money wasn't about what you could buy for yourself. It was about having the power to choose who benefited from your resources and who didn't. My children had chosen not to invest in my life when I needed them. Now I was choosing not to invest in their futures when they expected me to. It was the most expensive lesson I'd ever taught, and I was confident it was worth every penny. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a restlessness I hadn't felt in decades. The azaleas in Mrs. Chen's garden bloomed in violent shades of pink and purple, and something about their audacious beauty made me want to be audacious too. I found myself making decisions that would have seemed reckless a year ago but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never had time for when my life belonged to other people's schedules. The instructor was a woman named Elena who painted like she was having conversations with the canvas, and she had a way of encouraging students that made everyone feel like they might actually have hidden artistic talent. "Color doesn't lie," she told our class during the second week. "It shows exactly what you're feeling, whether you mean it to or not." I looked down at my painting, a simple landscape of the lake where I took my morning walks, and realized I'd been using colors I'd never been drawn to before. Bold blues and confident greens, shades that looked like hope and possibility instead of the careful neutrals I'd lived with for so long. Mrs. Chen started joining me for the classes after I mentioned them during one of our coffee mornings. She approached watercolor the same way she approached everything else, with methodical patience and surprising bursts of creativity. Her paintings were precise and delicate, like her garden, but they had an emotional depth that took my breath away. "You paint happy now," she observed one afternoon as we cleaned our brushes. "Different from before." She was right. I was happy, but it was a different kind of happiness than I'd known before. It wasn't the dependent happiness that came from other people's approval or the anxious happiness that required constant maintenance. It was the quiet satisfaction of a life that belonged entirely to me. In April, I received a call that would test exactly how committed I was to that independence. "Miss Hughes, this is Detective Morrison with the Riverside Police Department. I'm calling about your son, Marcus Hughes. He's been taken into custody, and you're listed as his emergency contact." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, my heart rate spiking in the way it does when you get unexpected news about your children, regardless of how complicated your relationship with them might be. "What happened? Is he hurt?" "He's not injured, ma'am. He's been arrested on charges related to investment fraud. Multiple counts. He's being held pending bail, and he asked us to contact you." Investment fraud. I closed my eyes and thought about all the times Marcus had called me with his latest financial schemes, all the opportunities that were too good to be true, all the promises of easy money and guaranteed returns. Apparently, someone had finally looked closely enough at his activities to realize what I'd suspected all along. "What kind of bail are we talking about?" The judge set it at $250,000. That means he'd need to come up with $25,000 in cash or collateral to get out. $25,000. Almost exactly the amount he'd asked me to lend him for his investment platform scheme. I wondered if there was a connection, if the money he'd wanted from me had been intended to cover up whatever fraudulent activity had finally caught up with him. "Ma'am? Are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. Can you tell me more about the charges?" Detective Morrison explained that Marcus had been running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme, taking money from investors with promises of extraordinary returns and using new investments to pay earlier investors while skimming substantial amounts for his personal use. The scheme had collapsed when too many people tried to withdraw their money at the same time, and the state attorney's office was estimating total losses at over $400,000. "He's going to need a lawyer," Detective Morrison said. "A good one. These are serious charges, and if he's convicted, he could be looking at significant prison time." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the lighthouse, painting and trying to sort through what I was feeling. There was sadness, certainly, for the boy Marcus had been before he'd convinced himself that rules didn't apply to him. There was anger at his victims, people who'd trusted him with their money and their futures. And there was something that took me a while to identify: relief. Relief that I hadn't given him the $10,000 he'd asked for at Thanksgiving. Relief that I'd seen clearly enough to recognize what he was becoming. Relief that I'd already made the decision to redirect my inheritance away from someone who would have used it to hurt other people. My phone rang twice that evening. The first call was from Rebecca. "Mom, did you hear about Marcus? This is insane. There has to be some kind of mistake." I spoke with the police. "It doesn't sound like a mistake." "But investment fraud? Marcus wouldn't do something like that. He's not a criminal." I listened to her defend her brother with the same energy she'd used to defend his poor grades and missed curfews when they were teenagers. Rebecca had always been quick to excuse behavior she didn't want to acknowledge, as if saying it wasn't that bad would somehow make it true. "The evidence seems pretty clear, Rebecca." "Well, what are we going to do? We can't just leave him in jail." There it was, the assumption that had defined my relationship with my children for decades. As if Marcus's problems automatically became family problems that required family solutions. As if his choices entitled him to other people's resources. "What do you mean, what are we going to do?" "About bail. About getting him out. About hiring a lawyer." Those sound like things Marcus needs to figure out for himself. Mom, he can't afford bail. And a good defense attorney is going to cost at least $50,000, probably more. Then maybe he should have thought about that before he decided to defraud people. You can't be serious. You're going to let your son sit in jail? I'm going to let my son face the consequences of his actions. There's a difference. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her recalibrating her approach. Mom, I know you're angry about what happened with the surgery money, but this is different. This is serious. The surgery was serious too. Cancer is serious. But somehow you all managed to decide that wasn't worth your financial sacrifice. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. You're asking me to spend money I may or may not have to solve a problem that Marcus created for himself, just like I asked you to help with a medical crisis I didn't create for myself. The only difference is that Marcus's problem is self-inflicted. But he's family. So am I, Rebecca. So am I. The second call came an hour later, from Patricia, and she was crying before I even said hello. Mom, this is all my fault. I should have seen this coming. I should have said something when Marcus started talking about all those investment opportunities. Patricia had always been the one to take responsibility for things that weren't her fault, as if she could somehow fix other people's problems by feeling guilty enough about them. It was an exhausting way to live, and I'd spent years trying to teach her that she wasn't responsible for other people's choices. This isn't your fault, Patricia. This is Marcus's fault. But what are we going to do? He's our brother. We can't just abandon him. We're not abandoning him. We're allowing him to face the natural consequences of his actions. Rebecca said you won't help with bail money. That's correct. But Mom, $25,000. That's not that much money, really. I mean, spread out among the three of us, it's manageable. I wondered if Patricia realized what she'd just said, if she understood that she'd casually suggested I contribute to her brother's bail fund after telling me that her family couldn't afford to help with my cancer surgery. $25,000 was manageable when it was for Marcus, but $34,000 had been impossible when it was for me. I'm not contributing to Marcus's bail fund, Patricia. Why not? I know you have some savings. You paid for the surgery yourself, so you must have money set aside. Having money and choosing to spend it are two different things. But this is an emergency. No, this is a consequence. Marcus chose to defraud people. Marcus chose to take money that didn't belong to him. Marcus chose to run a scheme that was always going to collapse eventually. Those were his choices, and now he gets to live with the results. You're being cold. I'm being realistic. Marcus is 42 years old, Patricia. He's not a child who made a mistake. He's a grown man who made a series of deliberate choices to hurt other people for his own benefit. Why should I reward that behavior with my money? Because he's your son. And I'm your mother, but that didn't motivate you to help when I needed it. She hung up on me, something Patricia had never done in her entire life. I stared at the phone for a moment, then set it aside and went back to the book I'd been reading, a biography of an artist who'd spent her life painting exactly what she wanted to paint, regardless of what other people thought she should be creating. The next morning, Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with fresh coffee and the kind of expression that meant she had something important to say. We'd developed enough of a friendship that she no longer felt the need to pretend she didn't speak English well when she had opinions to share. Your son is in trouble, she said without preamble as we sat at my kitchen table. Yes. Family is calling you for money. Yes. You said no. I did. She nodded approvingly. Good. Children who steal from strangers will steal from family. Better to let police teach the lesson than to teach it yourself. Mrs. Chen had a way of cutting through complicated emotional situations with the kind of clarity that came from decades of watching patterns repeat themselves. She'd raised 3 children of her own, buried a husband, navigated the complexities of being an immigrant in a country that didn't always welcome outsiders. She understood that love sometimes required saying no to the people you cared about most. My youngest son had gambling problem, she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Always needed money, always had big plans, always going to pay us back. My husband wanted to keep helping. I said no. Son angry for 2 years, didn't speak to us. But he got help, found better way to live. Now he thanks me for not giving him money to lose. How did you know when to stop helping? When helping became hurting. When our money made his problem easier instead of making his life better. That afternoon, I called Catherine Walsh to discuss setting up a victim compensation fund using money from my estate. If Marcus had defrauded people out of $400,000, I wanted to make sure his victims were made whole, even if he never had the ability to repay them himself. That's very generous, Sarah, Catherine said. But are you sure you want to use your money to clean up your son's mess? I'm not cleaning up his mess. I'm helping his victims. There's a difference. The practical result is the same. No, it's not. Marcus still faces all the legal consequences of his actions. He still has to live with what he's done. His victims just don't have to suffer financially because of his choices. And if Marcus finds out you're the one who compensated his victims? He won't find out until after I'm dead. The fund will be administered anonymously through the law firm, and the payments won't be made until after my estate is settled. You've really thought this through. I've had a lot of practice thinking through the consequences of other people's actions. Over the next few weeks, the local newspaper covered Marcus's case with the kind of attention that small towns reserve for scandals involving people they thought they knew. The headlines were brutal: local man accused of investment fraud, Ponzi scheme victims seek justice, trust fund baby turned con artist. That last headline stung, even though it wasn't technically accurate. Marcus had never had a trust fund, had never been particularly wealthy, had simply been good at convincing people he was more successful than he actually was. But the image fit the narrative people wanted to believe about financial fraud, that it was always committed by people who already had everything and wanted more. The truth was more complicated and more depressing. Marcus had committed fraud because he'd convinced himself he was entitled to easy money, because he'd believed his own hype about being special, because he'd never learned the difference between confidence and competence. I stopped reading the newspaper coverage after the first few articles. Whatever Marcus had done, whatever consequences he was facing, I didn't need to follow every detail of his downfall. It was enough to know that justice was being served and that his victims would eventually be compensated. Rebecca called again 2 weeks after Marcus's arrest, and her tone had shifted from disbelief to anger. I can't believe you're just sitting there while your son rots in jail. Marcus is sitting in jail because he committed crimes, not because I'm failing to rescue him from the consequences. We found a lawyer who's willing to take the case for $40,000. $40,000, Mom. That's nothing to you. Nothing to me. I wondered how Rebecca had arrived at that conclusion, what evidence she thought she had about my financial situation. As far as my children knew, I lived on Social Security and Robert's modest life insurance payout. I'd never given them any reason to think I had substantial assets. What makes you think $40,000 is nothing to me? Oh, come on, Mom. You paid $34,000 for surgery without blinking. You obviously have money saved up. Having enough money for one emergency doesn't mean I have unlimited funds for every crisis that comes up. This isn't just any crisis. This is Marcus. This is your son. Marcus is also a grown man who chose to defraud innocent people. Why should I hire him a lawyer to help him avoid responsibility for that choice? Because if you don't, he could go to prison. For years. Then maybe he shouldn't have committed crimes that carry prison sentences. Mom, I don't understand what's happened to you. You used to care about family. I used to enable bad behavior and call it caring about family. There's a difference. So that's it? You're just going to let him go to prison? I'm going to let the legal system work the way it's supposed to work. Marcus will get a public defender, he'll have a fair trial, and he'll face whatever consequences the judge and jury decide are appropriate for his crimes. A public defender? Mom, public defenders are overworked and underpaid. They don't have time to mount a real defense. Then Marcus should have thought about that before he decided to run a Ponzi scheme. You're being cruel. I'm being realistic. And I'm being fair to the people Marcus victimized. Why should I spend money to help him escape justice when he stole money from innocent people? Rebecca hung up on me too, making it 2 out of 3 children who had decided that cutting off communication was preferable to accepting that I wasn't going to fund their brother's defense. Only Patricia kept calling, though her conversations had become increasingly desperate and guilt-focused. Mom, Marcus could get 10 years in prison. 10 years. His life will be ruined. His life is already ruined, Patricia. He ruined it when he chose to steal money from people who trusted him. But if we help him now, maybe he can get a plea deal. Maybe he can serve less time, pay restitution, get his life back together. Marcus can pursue a plea deal with his public defender. That's exactly what public defenders do. You know that's not the same thing as having a good lawyer. Then maybe Marcus should have considered the importance of legal representation before he chose to commit felonies. Why are you being so stubborn about this? I'm not being stubborn. I'm being consistent. I told you when I needed help with surgery that I understood you couldn't afford to help me. Now I'm telling you that I can't afford to help Marcus. But that's not true. You have money. You paid for the surgery yourself. I had enough money for one medical emergency. I don't have enough money to fund legal defenses for family members who choose to become criminals. He's not a criminal. He made a mistake. Patricia, he ran a Ponzi scheme for over a year. He took money from dozens of people with no intention of ever giving it back. He used new investors to pay old investors while stealing from everyone. That's not a mistake. That's a deliberate pattern of criminal behavior. He's still our brother. And I'm still your mother. But somehow when I needed help, being family wasn't enough to motivate you to sacrifice for me. Why should being family be enough to motivate me to sacrifice for someone who's hurt innocent people? The silence. That followed. That question stretched long enough for me to realize that Patricia had never actually considered the parallel I was drawing. She'd never connected her refusal to help with my surgery to my refusal to help with Marcus's legal bills. In her mind, those were completely separate situations with completely different moral implications. That's different, she finally said. How? Because you're strong. You can handle things on your own. Marcus needs help. Marcus needs to face the consequences of his choices. That's how people learn not to hurt other people. So you're going to let him go to prison just to teach him a lesson? I'm going to let him go to prison because that's what happens when you commit fraud. The lesson is just a bonus. The trial was scheduled for late summer, and as the date approached, the pressure from my children intensified. Rebecca started sending me articles about the importance of family loyalty. Patricia left voicemails that were mostly sobbing and pleas for me to reconsider. Even Marcus himself wrote me a letter from jail, a handwritten note that arrived on a Tuesday morning with the kind of return address that made Mrs. Chen ask pointed questions about my family's legal troubles. The letter was exactly what I'd expected, a mixture of self-pity, blame-shifting, and manipulation disguised as contrition. Dear Mom, it began, I know you're disappointed in me, and you have every right to be. I made some bad decisions, and I'm paying the price for them. But I want you to know that I never intended to hurt anyone. I genuinely believed that the investment platform would work, that everyone would make money, that I'd be able to pay everyone back with profits to spare. The letter went on to explain how the scheme had spiraled out of control, how Marcus had gotten in over his head, how he'd been trying to fix things when everything collapsed. It was a masterpiece of self-justification, painting him as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of deliberate fraud. I know I don't deserve your help, the letter concluded, but I'm asking for it anyway. Not because I think I'm entitled to it, but because I know that if the situation were reversed, you'd want me to help you. That's the kind of family we've always been. That's the kind of person you raised me to be. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the same drawer where I kept copies of my updated will. Marcus was right about one thing: if the situation were reversed, I would want him to help me. Just like I'd wanted him to help me when I needed surgery money. The difference was that my situation had been a medical emergency I didn't cause, while his situation was a legal crisis he'd created through deliberate criminal behavior. But Marcus had never been good at understanding the difference between consequences and circumstances. That evening, I called Catherine Walsh to discuss my decision about Marcus's legal situation. I want to make sure the Victim Compensation Fund is fully funded and ready to go, I said. I want those people to know they'll be made whole, regardless of what happens to Marcus. The fund is ready, Sarah. $450,000. Enough to cover all documented losses plus interest and legal fees for the victims who want to pursue civil suits. Good. And you're sure it's structured so that Marcus will never know where the money came from? Absolutely. The fund will be administered through the law firm, payments will be made anonymously, and the source of the funding won't be revealed until after your estate is settled. Perfect. Now, I want to add one more element to my will. What kind of element? A letter to Marcus, explaining exactly why he received nothing from my estate and exactly how much money went to compensate his victims instead. Sarah, are you sure about that? That's going to be a very painful letter for him to receive. Good. Maybe pain will teach him something that enabling never could. I spent the next morning writing that letter, trying to find words that would explain my decision without being needlessly cruel. It was harder than I'd expected, finding the line between honesty and brutality, between education and revenge. Dear Marcus, I wrote, by the time you read this, my estate will have been settled and you will have learned that you inherited nothing from me. I want to explain why I made that choice, not because I owe you an explanation, but because I hope you'll finally understand the connection between choices and consequences. The letter went on to detail exactly how much money I'd had available when my children refused to help with my surgery, exactly how much I'd given to charity rather than leaving it to them, and exactly how much had been set aside to compensate his fraud victims. You once told me that family should help family, I wrote near the end. I agree. But help means supporting people in crisis, not enabling them to hurt others. I helped your victims because they didn't deserve to suffer for your choices. I didn't help you because you didn't deserve to escape the consequences of your choices. I hope you use your time in prison to learn the difference between confidence and competence, between charm and character, between taking what you want and earning what you deserve. I hope you become the man I once thought you were instead of the man you chose to become. I love you, Marcus. But I love justice more. I sealed the letter and gave it to Catherine to include with my will, knowing that it would be the last thing I'd ever be able to teach my son about right and wrong. The trial began on a Thursday in August, and I didn't attend. I didn't read the newspaper coverage, didn't follow the proceedings, didn't subject myself to the spectacle of watching my son try to convince a jury that his victims had somehow victimized themselves. Instead, I spent that week painting with Elena's class, working on a series of watercolors that captured the lake at different times of day. There was something therapeutic about focusing on light and shadow instead of guilt and blame, about creating something beautiful instead of dwelling on something ugly. Your work has real emotional depth, Elena told me as I worked on a sunset scene that had been giving me trouble for days. You paint like someone who's learned to see clearly. She was right. I had learned to see clearly, to recognize the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. It had taken me 68 years and a cancer diagnosis to figure it out, but I'd finally learned to trust my own judgment instead of other people's expectations. Marcus was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison. I learned about the verdict from Mrs. Chen, who heard it from her neighbor, who'd been following the trial in the local newspaper. I felt sad for the boy he'd been and relieved for the people he'd victimized, but mostly I felt nothing at all. He'd made his choices, and the legal system had responded appropriately. Justice had been served, and his victims would eventually be compensated. There was nothing left for me to feel or do or fix. Rebecca called that evening, her voice thick with tears and anger. Are you happy now? Your son is going to prison for 8 years because you were too selfish to help him. Marcus is going to prison for 8 years because he defrauded innocent people out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He could have gotten probation if he'd had a better lawyer. The public defender barely even tried to defend him. The public defender did his job. The evidence was overwhelming, Rebecca. Marcus was guilty of every charge, and the jury saw that clearly. So that's it? You're satisfied that your son's life is ruined? I'm satisfied that the people he victimized will get their money back and that he's facing appropriate consequences for his crimes. How can you be so cold about your own child? How can you be so unconcerned about the people he hurt? Marcus stole retirement savings from elderly people, Rebecca. He took money that families needed for medical expenses and children's education. He caused real harm to real people, and you're upset that he has to face consequences for that? Of course I care about his victims. But he's family. So were those elderly people to their families. So were those parents to their children. Marcus didn't just steal money, Rebecca. He stole security and peace of mind and faith in other people. He hurt dozens of families because he thought he was entitled to easy money. He made a mistake. He made a choice. Over and over again, for more than a year, he chose to take money that didn't belong to him. That's not a mistake. That's a character defect. And you're just going to abandon him? I'm going to let him serve his time and hopefully learn something from the experience. If he comes out of prison genuinely reformed, genuinely remorseful, genuinely committed to making amends for what he's done, then we can talk about rebuilding our relationship. 8 years, Mom. 8 years of his life. Yes. And 8 years for his victims to recover from what he did to them. 8 years for him to think about the harm he caused. 8 years to decide what kind of person he wants to be when he gets out. I can't believe you're okay with this. I'm not okay with any of it, Rebecca. I'm not okay that my son became a criminal. I'm not okay that innocent people lost their savings because of him. I'm not okay that his choices destroyed so many lives. But I'm also not going to pretend that loving him means protecting him from the consequences of his actions. After Rebecca hung up on me for the second time in 3 months, I sat on my back patio with a cup of tea and watched the sun set behind Mrs. Chen's garden. Her azaleas had finished blooming, but her summer flowers were starting to show color. Bright splashes of orange and yellow that looked like joy against the green backdrop of her carefully tended plants. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin serving his prison sentence. Tomorrow, his victims would start receiving anonymous payments that would restore their financial losses. Tomorrow, my children would wake up in a world where their mother had chosen justice over family loyalty and principle over enabling. And tomorrow, I would wake up in a world where my money was being used to help people instead of hurt them, where my choices reflected my values instead of other people's expectations, where my life belonged entirely to me. It had taken me 68 years to get to that place, but I'd finally arrived. And despite everything it had cost me, I couldn't imagine wanting to live any other way. The silence that followed Marcus's conviction stretched through the rest of August and into September. Like a held breath. My children stopped calling, stopped texting, stopped including me in the family group chat where they used to share photos of Rebecca's boys' soccer games and Patricia's classroom projects. I had been excommunicated from their version of family. Banished for the crime of refusing to fund their brother's escape from justice. The silence should have felt lonely, but instead it felt like freedom. For the first time in decades, my phone didn't ring with requests or complaints or subtle manipulations disguised as family concern. My evenings belonged to me, my weekends. Stretched open with possibility, my decisions required no one's approval but my own. I used that freedom deliberately. I signed up for a pottery class that met on Thursday mornings, something I'd always wanted to try but had never pursued because Thursdays had been the day Rebecca usually called to vent about her work stress. I joined a book club at the library, a group of 8 women who met monthly to discuss everything from romance novels to political biographies with equal passion and insight. Most importantly, I started traveling. Small trips at first, weekend getaways to cities within driving distance that I'd never bothered to explore when my life was anchored by other people's needs. I spent a long weekend in Charleston, walking through gardens that made Mrs. Chen's azaleas look modest by comparison. I drove to the mountains for a week in October, staying in a cabin where the only sounds were wind through pine trees and my own footsteps on hiking trails. Each trip felt like a small rebellion against the woman I'd been for so long, the one who stayed home and waited for phone calls and measured her worth by how available she was to solve other people's problems. I was discovering who Sarah Hughes was when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people, and I liked what I was finding. The first crack in my children's unified silence came in November, when Patricia sent me a birthday card. Not a phone call, not a visit, just a generic card with a bouquet of flowers on the front and "Happy Birthday, Mom" written in her careful teacher's handwriting inside. No personal message, no acknowledgement of the months of silence, no attempt to bridge the gap that had opened between us. I propped the card on my kitchen counter next to the small bouquet Mrs. Chen had brought me from her garden, and I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Pity for a daughter who thought a drugstore greeting card could substitute for genuine communication, who believed that going through the motions of caring was the same as actually caring. Rebecca's approach was more strategic. She waited until the week before Thanksgiving to call, catching me just as I was finishing my morning walk around the lake. "Mom, hi. I know we haven't talked in a while, but I wanted to reach out about the holidays." Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation, who'd planned exactly what to say and how to say it. I wondered how long she'd been working up the courage to make this call. How many times she'd started to dial my number and then changed her mind. "Hello, Rebecca. I was thinking that maybe we could get together for Thanksgiving. Nothing big, just family. I thought it might be good for all of us to reconnect." Reconnect. As if our problem was simply a communication breakdown rather than a fundamental disagreement about what family owed each other and what love actually meant in practice. "That's thoughtful of you to think of me." "Of course I think of you. You're my mother." "I'm your mother, but I'm also apparently the kind of person who abandons family members in their time of need. At least that's what you told me the last time we spoke." There was a pause, and I could picture Rebecca sitting in her pristine kitchen, trying to figure out how to navigate around the things she'd said in anger. "I was upset about Marcus. I said things I didn't mean." "Did you? Because from where I stood, you seemed to mean them pretty clearly." "Mom, I don't want to fight about this again. I just want us to be a family." "What does that mean to you, Rebecca? Being a family?" "It means being there for each other. Supporting each other. Forgiving each other when we make mistakes. And it means spending money to help each other when someone needs expensive surgery." "That's not fair." "It's perfectly fair. You want me to forgive you for not helping when I needed it, but you can't forgive me for not helping Marcus escape the consequences of committing crimes. You want us to be there for each other, but only when it's convenient and doesn't cost too much. Marcus is in prison, Mom. Prison. Don't you feel anything about that?" "I feel sad that he chose a path that led him there. I feel angry that he hurt so many innocent people. I feel relieved that justice was served. But I don't feel guilty for refusing to help him avoid accountability for his actions. He's your son. So is every person sitting in prison, right? Now someone's child. That doesn't mean their parents are obligated to fund their legal defense or feel responsible for their choices. But we could have made a difference. If we'd all worked together, we could have hired him a better lawyer. Maybe gotten him a plea deal." "Rebecca, Marcus was running a Ponzi scheme. The evidence was overwhelming. A better lawyer might have negotiated a slightly shorter sentence, but he was going to prison regardless because he committed serious crimes over an extended period of time." "So you're okay with him spending 8 years locked up?" I'm okay with him facing appropriate consequences for stealing money from dozens of people. I'm okay with his victims getting their money back. I'm okay with the legal system working the way it's supposed to work. And you're okay with our family being destroyed over this? I looked out my kitchen window at Mrs. Chen's garden, where she was covering her more delicate plants with tarps in preparation for the first frost of the season. She moved slowly but deliberately, protecting the things that mattered while accepting that some plants were strong enough to survive the cold on their own. Rebecca, our family was destroyed the moment you all decided that $34,000 was too much to spend on keeping your mother alive. Everything that's happened since then has just been the natural result of that choice. We didn't decide you weren't worth helping. We just couldn't afford it. You couldn't afford it, but somehow Marcus's bail and legal fees were worth going into debt for? That's different. How? Because you're strong. You figured out how to handle the surgery on your own. Marcus needed help. I needed help too, Rebecca. I needed help from my children when I was facing cancer surgery alone. But you calculated the cost and decided it was too expensive. Marcus needs help now because he chose to become a criminal, and you think that's worth any sacrifice. You're twisting everything around. I'm pointing out a pattern. When I needed help with something I didn't cause, you couldn't afford to assist me. When Marcus needs help with something he deliberately caused, suddenly family loyalty requires unlimited financial sacrifice. Fine. You want to hold grudges forever, that's your choice. But don't blame us when you end up spending the holidays alone. She hung up before I could respond, but her parting words stuck with me for the rest of the day. Don't blame us when you end up spending the holidays alone. As if loneliness was the worst thing that could happen to a person, as if being alone was automatically worse than being surrounded by people who treated you badly. I'd been alone for most of my adult life in ways that mattered. Alone when I'd worked double shifts to pay for my children's activities while Robert traveled for work. Alone when I'd sat through their school conferences and medical appointments. And emotional crises because he was building the business that would eventually make us wealthy. Alone when I'd made the difficult decisions about his end-of-life care because he was too sick to participate and the children were too overwhelmed to help. Being physically alone for the holidays would be a change, but it wouldn't be a hardship. And it certainly wouldn't be worse than sitting around Rebecca's table pretending we were a happy family while everyone carefully avoided mentioning the elephant in the room. I spent Thanksgiving with Mrs. Chen and her family, an invitation that came naturally after weeks of morning coffee conversations where she'd listened to me work through my complicated feelings about my children's silence. Her son and daughter-in-law were warm and welcoming, her granddaughters were delightfully energetic, and the entire day felt like what family was supposed to feel like: genuine affection, mutual respect, and gratitude for shared time. Your children will come around eventually, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law told me as we cleaned dishes together after dinner. Sometimes people need time to realize they've been wrong. Maybe, I said. But I'm not waiting around for them to figure it out. I'm too old to spend what time I have left hoping other people will become who I wish they were. December brought the first anonymous payments to Marcus's victims, distributed through the law firm exactly as Catherine and I had planned. I didn't contact any of the recipients directly, but word traveled through Riverside's tight-knit community that somehow, mysteriously, everyone who'd lost money in Marcus Hughes's scheme was being made whole. The local newspaper ran a story about the unexpected windfall, interviewing several victims who expressed amazement and gratitude that someone had stepped forward to compensate them for their losses. One elderly man who'd lost his entire retirement savings broke down crying during his interview, saying he'd given up hope of ever seeing his money again. "It's like a Christmas miracle," he said. "Someone out there believed we deserved to get our lives back." Reading that article was the first time I'd felt genuinely proud of one of my financial decisions since Robert's death. This was what money was supposed to do: solve real problems for people who deserved help through no fault of their own. This was what generosity looked like when it was directed toward people who actually needed assistance rather than people who felt entitled to it. The mystery of the Victim Compensation Fund generated considerable speculation around town. People theorized about wealthy benefactors, anonymous donors, insurance settlements, or legal victories that hadn't been reported in the press. No one suspected that the money had come from the mother of the man who defrauded them, partly because my children had done such a thorough job of portraying me as someone who couldn't even afford to help her son's legal defense. I enjoyed the irony more than I probably should have. My children thought I was too poor and selfish to help Marcus avoid prison, while I was actually wealthy enough to ensure that his victims didn't suffer permanent financial harm because of his crimes. They'd created a narrative about my limitations that suited their need to justify their anger, never realizing that their story was completely disconnected from reality. Christmas approached with the same careful silence from my children that had defined the past few months. No calls about Holiday plans, no invitations to family gatherings, no awkward attempts to maintain traditions that had become meaningless. They were proving their point about family loyalty by excluding me from their celebrations, apparently not realizing that exclusion from dysfunction was actually a gift. I spent Christmas Eve at a candlelight service at the small church I'd started attending, not because I'd become particularly religious but because I discovered that I enjoyed the ritual and community of shared reflection. The service was simple and moving, focused on themes of redemption and new beginnings that felt personally relevant. Christmas Day itself was quiet and peaceful. I made myself a small but elaborate brunch, opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion, and spent the afternoon reading a novel I'd been looking forward to for weeks. In the evening, I called Mrs. Chen to thank her again for including me in her family's Thanksgiving celebration, and we made plans to see a movie together the following week. It was the most relaxing Christmas I'd had in years, unmarred by family drama or gift-giving obligations or the exhausting emotional labor of managing other people's expectations. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. The new year brought an unexpected visitor. Patricia showed up at my door on a cold Saturday morning in late January, looking thinner than I remembered and wearing the kind of hollow expression that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom, can we talk? Please?" I let her in and made coffee while she sat at my kitchen table and fidgeted with her purse strap in the nervous way she'd had since childhood. Whatever she'd come to say, it had taken considerable courage for her to get this far. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," she said after I'd set a mug in front of her. "About Marcus, about the surgery, about all of it." I waited for her to continue, curious to see what conclusions she'd reached during our months of silence. "I think maybe you were right. About some things, anyway." "What things specifically?" "About Marcus needing to face consequences for what he did. I've been reading about his case, about the people he hurt, and I guess I didn't really understand how bad it was when it first happened." "It was very bad, Patricia. He destroyed people's financial security for his own benefit." "I know that now. And I've been thinking about what you said, about how we all found money for things we wanted but couldn't find money to help you when you needed surgery." She paused to take a sip of coffee, gathering courage for whatever came next. "Jake got a new job in December. Good pay, benefits, the whole thing. And when he got his first paycheck, I realized we could have helped you with the surgery money. If we'd really wanted to. We just chose not to because it seemed like too much money and we figured you'd manage somehow." "I did manage. I know. But that doesn't make it right. We should have helped you, Mom. We should have found a way." "Yes, you should have. And I'm sorry. I'm really, genuinely sorry that we let you down when you needed us." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but Patricia had never been good at hiding her feelings. Her apology seemed genuine, motivated by guilt and regret rather than a desire to get something from me. "I appreciate the apology, Patricia. Do you forgive me?" "I forgive you for not helping with the surgery money. You were right that you couldn't afford it at the time, and I understand that financial stress makes people cautious about taking on additional obligations. But I don't forgive you for assuming I was too strong to need help. I don't forgive you for treating my medical crisis like it was less important than Marcus's legal crisis. And I don't forgive you for months of silence because I wouldn't fund your brother's escape from justice." "That's fair," she said quietly. "Is it? Because I'm not sure fairness is what you're looking for here." "What do you mean?" "I mean that apologizing is easy, Patricia. Feeling guilty is easy. What's hard is examining the pattern of thinking that led to the behavior you're apologizing for and making real changes so it doesn't happen again. I have been examining it. That's why I'm here." "Good. And what have you concluded?" "That I've been taking you for granted. That I've been assuming you don't need the same kind of support we all need because you're good at handling problems on your own." "What else?" "That maybe I've been more concerned with what's convenient for me than with what's actually right." "What else?" She thought for a moment, clearly struggling with whatever insight she was reluctant to voice. "That maybe I don't actually know you as well as I thought I did. That maybe I've been treating you like a role instead of like a person." That admission surprised me with its accuracy. Patricia had always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, but she'd also been the most likely to see what she wanted to see rather than what was actually in front of her. "That's very perceptive. So where does that leave us, Mom? I mean, I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to try to do better going forward." "What does doing better look like to you?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe starting with treating you like someone whose opinions and feelings matter instead of someone who exists to solve problems and provide support when convenient. That would be a good start. And maybe actually getting to know who you are now instead of assuming you're the same person you were when I was growing up. Also a good start. Will you give me a chance to try?" To rebuild our relationship on better terms? I looked at her sitting at my kitchen table, earnest and nervous and genuinely remorseful, and felt something I hadn't experienced with any of my children in months: hope. Not hope that she'd become perfect, but hope that she might become honest about her imperfections. I'm willing to try, Patricia. But I need you to understand that our relationship can't go back to what it was before. I'm not the same person I was a year ago, and I'm not interested in returning to a dynamic where I give endlessly and you take whenever it's convenient. I understand. Do you? Because that means no more assuming I'll drop everything to babysit, or help with household projects or provide emotional support whenever you're stressed. It means treating me like someone whose time and energy have value instead of someone whose availability is unlimited. I can do that. And it means accepting that I have a life and interests and priorities that don't revolve around you and your siblings. I'm not just sitting here waiting for you to need me. I know. I can see that. You seem happier than you've been in a long time. She was right about that. I was happier, but it was the kind of happiness that came from living authentically rather than living to meet other people's expectations. It was the happiness of a woman who'd finally learned to value herself as much as she valued everyone else. I am happier. And part of that happiness comes from having boundaries that protect my time and energy for things that actually matter to me. What things matter to you now? The question caught me off guard, partly because it was the first time any of my children had ever asked me about my personal interests and partly because it forced me to articulate priorities I'd been developing unconsciously over the past year. My art classes matter to me. My friendship with Mrs. Chen matters to me. The book club I joined matters to me. Traveling and seeing places I've never been matters to me. Using my money to help people who actually need help matters to me. Your money? I realized I'd said more than I'd intended, but Patricia's question hung in the air between us with the weight of years of unasked questions and unexamined assumptions. Yes, my money. The money I used to pay for surgery that you all thought was too expensive for me to afford. Mom, how much money do you actually have? The question I'd been waiting for someone to ask for over a year. The question that would have changed everything if any of my children had been curious enough to voice it when I first needed their help. Enough, Patricia. I have enough money to take care of myself comfortably, to help people who deserve help, and to make choices based on my values rather than my limitations. But when we couldn't help with the surgery money, you never said. I never said what? That you should help me anyway? That family obligation should override financial stress? That you should sacrifice for me the way I'd always sacrificed. For you? You could have told us you could afford it yourself. I could have. But then I never would have learned what I needed to know about my children's priorities. What do you mean? I mean that asking for help when you don't actually need it is manipulation. I wanted to know whether you'd help me when you thought I really needed it, not whether you'd help me when you knew I could manage without you. So the whole thing was a test? No, Patricia. The surgery was real, the money was real, the need for help was real. But your response was also real, and it taught me something important about who you are when helping requires genuine sacrifice. She was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what I'd told her. I could see her working through the memories, recalculating interactions, trying to figure out how much of what she'd believed about my financial situation had been true. How much money are we talking about, Mom? Does it matter? I think it does, yeah. Because if you've been wealthy this whole time and we've been worrying about your finances. You haven't been worrying about my finances, Patricia. You've been assuming that my financial limitations relieved you of any obligation to help me when I needed it. That's not true. Isn't it? When's the last time any of you asked whether I needed help with anything? When's the last time you offered to contribute to my expenses or wondered whether I was managing okay on my fixed income? We figured you'd ask if you needed help. Like I asked for help with surgery money? That's different. How? Because that was an emergency. And my day-to-day expenses aren't important enough to worry about unless they become emergencies? She didn't answer, but her silence was answer enough. My children had been content to assume I was managing fine as long as I didn't actively ask for their help, but they'd never been curious enough about my actual situation to offer assistance or even inquire about my needs. Mom, I feel like everything I thought I knew about our family was wrong. Not wrong, exactly. Just incomplete. You knew the version of me that I thought you needed, but you never bothered to learn about the version of me that actually exists. Why didn't you tell us? About the money, I mean? Because money changes relationships, Patricia. People start treating you differently when they know you're wealthy. They start calculating what they might inherit, or they start resenting your good fortune, or they start assuming that having money means you don't have any other problems worth caring about. We wouldn't have done that. Wouldn't you? Look how you reacted when you thought I couldn't afford to help Marcus. You decided I was selfish and uncaring because I wouldn't spend money you thought I didn't have. How do you think you would have reacted if you'd known I was refusing to spend money I definitely did have? I don't know. Ido. You would have been furious. You would have decided that being wealthy obligated me to fund your brother's legal defense, regardless of whether his crimes deserved that kind of support. Maybe. Definitely. Because that's exactly how you reacted when you found out I could afford surgery myself. Your first thought wasn't relief that I was financially secure. It was anger that I'd let you feel guilty about not helping when I didn't actually need your help. She couldn't argue with that assessment because it was exactly what had happened. Learning about my financial situation had made her angry rather than relieved, resentful rather than happy for my security. So what happens now, Mom? Do we start over? Do we try to build something different? That depends on whether you're willing to get to know the person I actually am instead of the person you need me to be. I want to try. Then we'll try. But slowly, Patricia. And with real honesty this time, instead of the kind of selective honesty that protects everyone's feelings. I can do that. We'll see. After she left, I sat in my kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee and thought about second chances, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about the possibility that people could actually change. If they wanted to badly enough. Patricia's visit had been a surprise, but not an unpleasant one. She'd shown more genuine insight and accountability than I'd expected, more willingness to examine her own behavior than I'd seen from any of my children in years. Maybe there was hope for rebuilding something meaningful with at least one of them. Maybe all the pain and distance and silence had been worth it if it led to a relationship based on mutual respect rather than mutual obligation. Only time would tell whether Patricia's remorse would translate into lasting change, whether her promises would hold up under the pressures of real life and competing priorities. But for the first time in months, I was curious to find out rather than resigned to disappointment. It was a start. 2 years passed before I heard from Rebecca again. 2 years of steady progress with Patricia, who proved surprisingly committed to rebuilding our relationship on more honest terms. We met for lunch once a month, took a pottery class together, and had conversations that actually involved her asking about my life rather than just updating me on hers. She never asked for money, never assumed my availability, never treated me like a resource to be managed rather than a person to be known. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, interrupting my reading with the kind of ring that suggested urgency or desperation. Rebecca's voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before, tight with the kind of control that meant she was barely holding herself together. Mom, I need to talk to you. It's about David. David, her husband, the man who'd been putting in overtime to cover their health insurance premiums when I'd needed surgery money. The father of her 2 boys, the practical partner who balanced her tendency toward perfectionism with steady reliability. What's wrong? He's been having chest pains. Bad ones. The doctors think it might be his heart, but they need to run more tests. Expensive tests that our insurance doesn't fully cover. I waited for her to continue, curious to see whether she'd learned anything from our family's history with medical crises and financial stress. The thing is, we've already hit our deductible for the year because of some issues with the boys, and now we're looking at another $15,000 in out-of-pocket costs just for the diagnostic work. If he needs surgery. She trailed off, and I could hear her breathing carefully, trying to maintain composure. I'm sorry to hear about David's health scare. That must be very frightening for all of you. It is. And I know this is awkward, given everything that's happened between us, but I was wondering if you might be able to help. With the medical costs, I mean. There it was, the request I'd been expecting for 2 years. The moment when Rebecca's financial stress would overcome her pride and force her to confront the reality of what she'd done when I'd been in a similar situation. Tell me about your financial situation, Rebecca. What do you mean? I mean exactly what you think I mean. How much money do you have available for David's medical care? What assets could you liquidate if you had to? What sacrifices are you prepared to make to ensure he gets the treatment he needs? Mom, we don't have any significant savings. The house is mortgaged, the cars are financed, we're already stretched thin with the boys' activities and school expenses. So you have no money available to help your husband with potentially life-saving medical care? Not without going into serious debt or selling major assets. But you have assets to sell. You have a house worth at least $400,000, cars that could be downgraded, children's activities that could be eliminated temporarily. You want us to sell our house? I want you to understand what it feels like to be asked to sacrifice for someone else's medical emergency when you believe you can't afford it. There was a long silence, and I could practically hear Rebecca processing the parallel I was drawing. She was smart enough to understand what I was doing, experienced enough to recognize the trap she'd walked into. This is about the surgery money, isn't it? This is about priorities, Rebecca. This is about what you're willing to sacrifice. When someone you love needs expensive medical care. That's not fair. We really couldn't afford to help you back then. And you really can't afford to help David now. But somehow I suspect you'll find a way, won't you? You'll take out loans, sell things, ask other family members for help, do whatever it takes to make sure he gets the care he needs. Of course. We will. He's my husband. And I was your mother. But $34,000 was too much to risk for my life. Mom, please. I'm asking for your help. David is a good man, he doesn't deserve to suffer because of mistakes I made years ago. You're right. David is a good man, and he doesn't deserve to suffer. Just like I didn't deserve to face cancer surgery alone because my children decided my life wasn't worth their financial sacrifice. So you're going to punish David for my mistakes? I'm not punishing anyone, Rebecca. I'm simply applying the same standard you applied to me. If $15,000 is too much for you to manage without help, then $34,000 was certainly too much for me to manage without help. But you had money. You could afford the surgery yourself. And you have assets. You could afford David's medical care yourself if you were willing to make sacrifices. It's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. The only difference is that now you understand what it feels like to be on the asking side instead of the refusing side. Rebecca started crying then, the kind of desperate tears that come when someone realizes they're trapped by their own logic and can't find a way out. I listened to her sob and felt something I hadn't expected, sympathy. Not enough to change my mind, but enough to remember that she was scared and overwhelmed and facing the possibility of losing someone she loved. Rebecca, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to help you, but not in the way you're expecting. What do you mean? I'm going to give you the names of 3 medical loan companies that specialize in financing diagnostic procedures and surgeries. I'm going to give you information about hospital financial assistance programs that can reduce costs for families in your income bracket. And I'm going to give you the contact information for a social worker who helps families navigate medical crises. But what about money? Actual financial help? You'll figure it out, Rebecca. You'll find a way to pay for David's care because that's what people do when they love someone enough to sacrifice for them. You'll discover resources you didn't know existed, ask for help from people you never thought to approach, make sacrifices you never imagined you could make. Why won't you just help us? Because helping you wouldn't teach you anything. Struggling to find solutions will teach you what I learned when you abandoned me, that love without sacrifice is just sentiment, that family who won't help in crisis aren't really family, and that you're stronger than you think you are when you have to be. You're being cruel. I'm being consistent. I'm treating you exactly the way you treated me, with exactly the same consideration you showed for my medical crisis. But we're family. Yes, we are. And family should help family. You taught me that the definition of help, apparently, doesn't include financial sacrifice when it's inconvenient. So I'm applying your definition. After Rebecca hung up, I sat with my phone in my lap and thought about justice versus mercy, about teaching moments versus cruelty, about the difference between consequences and revenge. Was I being too harsh? Was I letting my own hurt override my compassion for David, who was innocent in all of this? I called Catherine Walsh the next morning. Sarah, how can I help you today? I want to set up an anonymous fund to help with medical expenses for David Morrison. He's Rebecca's husband, and he's facing some significant diagnostic costs that their insurance won't cover. How much are we talking about? $25,000 should cover whatever he needs and leave some buffer for unexpected costs. And this will be completely anonymous? Completely. They should receive notification that an anonymous benefactor has established a medical fund in David's name, administered through the hospital's financial assistance program. No way to trace it back to me. May I ask why you're helping anonymously instead of directly? Because David doesn't deserve to suffer for Rebecca's choices, but Rebecca doesn't deserve the satisfaction of knowing I rescued her from consequences she needs to experience. Catherine arranged everything within 48 hours. David would receive excellent medical care without financial stress, but Rebecca would spend several agonizing days believing she was on her own before the mysterious assistance materialized. She'd experienced just enough fear and desperation to understand what I'd felt when she'd refused to help me, but not enough to actually harm her family. 3 weeks later, Patricia called to tell me that David's tests had revealed a minor heart condition that was easily treatable with medication, and that somehow his medical bills had been covered by an anonymous donor. Rebecca's been going crazy trying to figure out who helped them, Patricia said. She's convinced it was someone from David's work, or maybe the church, but no one will admit to it. That's very fortunate for them. She feels terrible about calling you for money. She knows she had no right to ask, given what happened with your surgery? She had every right to ask. I had every right to say no. Do you think she learned anything from this? I think she learned what it feels like to be desperate enough to ask for help and terrified that the answer will be no. Whether she connects that experience to what she put me through is up to her. And Marcus? Have you heard anything about his situation? Marcus had been a forbidden topic between us for 2 years, but Patricia's question felt like a genuine inquiry rather than a manipulation. She'd earned the right to ask about her brother without having to worry about my reaction. He writes occasionally. Short letters, mostly updates about the classes he's taking or the books he's reading. Nothing about early release or appeals or how unfair his situation is. That's good, right? That he's not trying to manipulate you? It's progress. Whether it's genuine change or just a different strategy remains to be seen. Do you think you'll have a relationship with him when he gets out? I think that depends on who he is when he gets out. If he's genuinely reformed, genuinely remorseful, genuinely committed to making amends for what he did, then we can talk about rebuilding something. If he's just better at hiding his sense of entitlement, then probably not. And Rebecca? Rebecca is learning that actions have consequences and that family loyalty isn't a one-way street. Whether she learns those lessons well enough to change her behavior is up to her. That summer, I took a trip to Europe, something I'd always wanted to do but had never pursued when my life was organized around other people's schedules and needs. I spent 3 weeks exploring art museums and historic gardens, eating meals that took hours and required no conversation with anyone who knew my history or had opinions about my choices. It was the most liberating experience I'd had since Robert's death, the complete freedom to be curious and spontaneous without having to consider anyone else's preferences or limitations. I came home with a renewed appreciation for the life I'd built for myself and a clearer understanding of what I wanted the rest of my years to look like. Mrs. Chen was waiting for me with a week's worth of mail and a potted orchid she'd been tending in my absence. We spent the afternoon on my back patio, drinking tea and comparing her granddaughter's summer adventures with my European discoveries. You look different, she observed as we watched the sunset paint her garden in shades of golden purple. More settled. Like you finally know who you are. She was right. At 70 years old, I finally knew who Sarah Hughes was when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people. I was someone who cared about art and books and meaningful conversations. Someone who valued honesty over harmony and justice over convenience. Someone who understood that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, just enabling disguised as affection. Most importantly, I was someone who had learned to trust her own judgment about who deserved her time, energy, and resources. I'd spent decades giving freely to people who took without gratitude and then criticized me when I finally stopped. Now I gave deliberately to people and causes that actually appreciated and used well what I offered. My charitable giving had expanded significantly over the years, funding scholarships and medical research and community programs that made real differences in people's lives. Every quarterly donation felt like a small victory, money that would help people who needed assistance rather than enabling people who felt entitled to it. The Victim Compensation Fund had been completely distributed, with every person Marcus had defrauded receiving full restitution plus interest. Several had written thank you letters to the anonymous donor, expressing gratitude not just for the financial relief but for the restoration of their faith in human kindness. Reading those letters was more satisfying than any family holiday or birthday celebration I'd experienced in years. This was what family was supposed to feel like: mutual care, genuine gratitude, and the knowledge that you'd made someone's life better rather than more complicated. On my 71st birthday, I updated my will one final time. The bulk of my estate would still go to the charities I'd chosen, but I added a modest bequest for Patricia, recognizing her genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship on more honest terms. Rebecca and Marcus received nothing, along with letters explaining exactly why their inheritance had been redirected to people who understood the difference between love and entitlement. I sealed those letters with a sense of completion rather than satisfaction. They weren't meant to be cruel, just educational. One last lesson about consequences, delivered when it was too late for them to argue with my decision or attempt to change my mind. That evening, Patricia called to wish me happy birthday and to share some news that surprised me. Mom, Jake and I are pregnant again. I wanted you to be the first to know. Congratulations, honey. That's wonderful news. We were wondering, actually, if you'd like to be involved this time. Really involved, I mean. Not just the grandmother who gets updates and visits occasionally, but someone who helps us figure out how to be good parents. The offer touched me more than I'd expected. Patricia was asking me to be part of her family in a meaningful way, recognizing that I had wisdom and experience worth sharing. She was treating me like someone whose presence would add value to her child's life rather than someone whose only purpose was to provide emergency assistance when needed. I'd love that, Patricia. I'd love to be the kind of grandmother who actually knows her grandchildren. Good. Because we're going to need all the help we can get. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was what resolution looked like. Not perfect reconciliation with everyone who'd hurt me, but meaningful connection with the people who'd been willing to change. Not the family I'd once had, but the family I'd chosen to build from the pieces that were worth saving. Outside my window, Mrs. Chen was in her garden again, tending to plants that would bloom long after she was gone. She looked up and waved, and I waved back, thinking about legacy and growth and the difference between the flowers that survived because they were strong and the ones that survived because they were cared for properly. I'd spent most of my life trying to be the kind of person who bloomed no matter how little care I received. Now I was learning to be the kind of person who bloomed because I'd finally learned to care for myself as well as I'd always cared for everyone else. It was the best birthday gift I could have given myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.